Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Salamanders, the 18th Legion, the Masters of Forge and Flame. We're going to be going through their Legion trait and their advanced reaction, their Warlord traits, and also their excellent armory equipment choices as well. But before we do that, if you enjoy the show, please do leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments or feedback at all, please leave them down below on YouTube. And now, on with the show. Their Legion trait is called Blood of Fire, and what this does is it gives Flame, Plasma, Melter, and Volkite weapons, so a fairly good spread of common weapons in the game. -1 to wound all of your stuff. Technically works on vehicles, but you don't roll to wound vehicles, so works on dreadnoughts, everything else. Most common weapon types that this doesn't hit, las cannons and bolt weapons, probably. So in any given game, this is definitely going to affect some of the things your opponent is shooting you with, but a lot of the things your opponent is shooting you with it will do nothing against. It also gives you, it will not die 6+ on any model in the army that's got more than 1 wound. So again, dreadnoughts, also terminators and that kind of stuff technically, although it's not a very powerful rule. It will not die, particularly on 2 wound models, but it is something. It gives you -1 to wound, not -1 strength, is an important differentiation to make as well compared to some Legion traits. So even high strength weapons, so like a melter gun shooting at a Space Marine, is still going to wound you on a 3, which is kind of cool. But it does mean that it doesn't change instant death thresholds on the other hand as well. So that melter gun shooting at a Terminator might need a 3+ to wound them, but if it goes through his armor, it is going to instant death him. That does stack with the it will not die part, so if you're a dreadnought, for example, you're going to get the -1 to wound versus some common weapons, and it will not die as well, which is kind of nice to get both sides of this. Still not the most powerful buff in the world, though. It's going to have an impact in most games because Melter, Plasma, and Volkite are quite common, but it's going to have less of an impact than the stronger Legion traits, just because there's so many things it doesn't affect. And then, you know, when you combine that with the fact that a lot of the times you're playing against melee armies as well, there's quite a lot of times when this trait isn't doing a lot for you, and that makes it ultimately one of the weaker Legion traits around. Their advanced reaction's an interesting one. It's called Duty as Sacrifice. So when you get charged, before the opponent's rolled their charge roll, just when they declare it, you use this. Your unit gets +1 weapon skill, strength, and attack. So that's a huge buff. Particularly the weapon skill is a really big deal, but attacks is quite hard to come by. You know, you don't get a lot of ways to increase attacks in the game as well. It's really good. It makes things like Fire Drakes beat most other elite Terminators really easily. Like, your whole unit's going to be weapon skill 6. They're all going to have an extra attack with their Thunder Hammers or something. Similarly for command squads as well. It means that if the enemy charges you, you're probably going to win the combat quite handily, which is quite major. It also means that other non-combat units, like, are going to be quite good as well. So if you imagine just a unit of Space Marines, like 20 Space Marines, all being weapon skill 5, means they're going to take a lot less hits from whoever's attacking them, and it means that they're going to put out quite a lot of, you know, strength 5 attacks as well. So it's mostly defensive in that case, but it, you know, it's still quite a big buff to whatever you use it on. There is a drawback to it. You roll a dice for every model at the end of the combat on a roll of a 6 to take a wound. It's not much of a drawback. You know, if you use that on 5 Fire Drakes, it often won't do any damage at all. But it is a drawback, and most advanced reactions don't come with a drawback, and this does have one. And it's used up even if the enemy fails their charge as well, which is a bit of a shame. So if the enemy doesn't pass their charge roll, you get Fearless for your whole next turn as well, which is, you know, kind of okay, but a lot of the time isn't just going to do much at all. So very high potential upside to this, but in some games it's going to do little to nothing. You know, shooting phase advanced reactions are always good. You'll always find a use for them. Assault phase ones, some games you won't really find any reason to use them at all. And this is one of those. And even though it's got a great buff, you lose it if your opponent fails the charge too. So quite good when it works. Potentially very, very scary when it works on things like Fire Drakes. But sometimes in a lot of games won't be doing a lot for you at all. Their first Warlord trait's called the Weight of Duty, and it's loyalists only. It gives the Warlord and his unit +1 strength versus fear causing enemies in melee, which is just the nichest of the niche abilities. But what it does give you is Hatred of Traitors as well, which is very good. That's a very, very big melee buff. Rerolling all your hits is just gigantic. I've, you know, have this myself on Medusan Immortals in Iron Hands Hatred, and it turns combat units that maybe don't do an awful lot into combat units that do an awful lot. So that's a pretty big buff. It's got drawbacks in that you can't take some destroyer type units, Moritats destroyers, that kind of stuff, which aren't very big, but they are drawbacks nonetheless. They are things that you might want to take in your army. Destroyers with hand flamers could be quite good in Salamanders, and you lock yourself out of those, for example. And a lot of Warlord traits don't have a drawback, whereas this does. There's a bit of a theme going on for Salamanders here, and it gives you an assault phase reaction. So this is potentially decent, particularly if you are playing Traitors versus Loyalist game modes. This is pretty good for giving hatred to a whole unit. Then we've got Promethean Will, so this gives the unit +1 leadership versus pinning to a maximum of 11, and reduces all fear effects on the unit by 1 as well. So that's pretty good, but there are quite a lot of leadership modifying Warlord traits around that just give you +1 leadership or make you auto-pass pinning tests and that kind of stuff. So on balance, not super exciting compared to what some other people get. And it's got the same destroyer-based drawbacks as well, you know, which is not a major drawback, but it is a drawback. And they get a shooting phase reaction. I think if you're gunning for a shooting phase reaction, you'd probably rather be taking the Book trait that makes your unit cause pinning. I don't think this is super good. But, you know, if you have got a unit that you're worried about getting pinned, maybe not that much a deal, and maybe something you would be considered taking. Lastly, we've got Redemption of Flames, which is traitor only. This gives the Warlord's unit +1 to wound with Flame and Volkite shooting attacks. Now, that is really good. And it's traitor locked. What a real shame that, you know, the most powerful, you know, thing that they've got that really plays into the Salamanders theme, being better with Flame and also Volkite there as well, is locked to traitor Salamanders. Just seems like a very odd decision to me. And, you know, this is actually common to quite a few Loyalist Legions, is that they get a really good trait, but it's locked to traitors. Kind of weird. Assault phase reaction is good as well. Very, very good Warlord trait. Just not something that you'll be seeing very much, unfortunately. So onto their armory. They've got a few different bits in their army, but I've condensed them a little bit into the important bits. So firstly, they've got Artifice and Flame, which allows you to mastercraft a weapon on any character for 10 points. Pretty good thing to get access to, but mastercrafted kind of expensive for 10 points. Potentially good on something like a Thunderhammer Sergeant, just because Sergeants, or Thunderhammers rather, are so good, but that does make them quite pricey. And if you run into snipers, that's a very juicy target. Definitely good for the coolness factor though, plays very much into the Salamanders theme. And if you do want to, you know, improve your Salamanders models by modelling on some master-crafted weapons, giving them some uniqueness, this gives you some rules to go through that, which is really good as well. But for most cases, I would say this is a little bit on the expensive side from a gameplay point of view. Then we've got Dragon's Breath weapons and the Dragon's Breath special rule as well. So all in all, with the rules in this part of the book, you can basically change any flame weapon for the Dragon's Breath equivalent. Artifice and Flame lets you do that. I'm not quite sure why that lets you do that as well as Dragon's Breath weapons. Maybe some odd typing. But long story short, every flamer in a Salamander's army is going to be one of these. And essentially, they get +1 strength. And when they Wall of Death in Overwatch, instead of doing D3 hits, they do D6 hits. And these are a free upgrade. Now, that's pretty big. That's a really big buff. A bigger buff over the normal weapon than a lot of other legions get to their weapons that they buff, and it doesn't cost anything, which is great. I really like flamers. I think they're an underrated weapon. I think they're pretty good at killing things and they're cheap. Now in this case, just looking at some quick stats for what these do, 5 of these shooting 5 Terminators, assuming you cover all 5 Terminators, would do almost 3 wounds. Now that's a dead Terminator, that's an 85 point unit. That one dead Terminator is normally about 40 points, maybe 50, 60. That's actually a pretty good rate of return. 5 flamers against 10 power armor marines. I always do my head maths with this, assuming I'm going to hit about 8. Would do nearly 9 wounds, so you'd nearly kill the whole unit. You hit a couple less with some of them flamers because of positioning, you're still going to do 7, 8 wounds, 6 maybe even. You kill quite a lot of marines with just 5 flamers with this weapon. And if you do fire them in Overwatch, you're averaging 17 strength 5 hits, which is quite a scary number to run into, really. As I said, I think flames are quite underrated, and this takes them from underratedly good to just good. It increases their offensive power substantially with that +1 strength, especially when you look at heavy flamers, which will then wound most things on a 2, most marines on a 2, and it gives them that defensive power. You know, these close range weapons like flamers are quite vulnerable to just being charged buy anything that's even half good in combat, but your opponent will certainly think twice when they're going to take so many free hits from those Dragon's Breath weapons. As always with Flamers, all of the power and the good stuff about these is balanced out with needing to get them there, but they are quite cheap and they're very effective at what they do, you know, to compensate for that drawback. And giving them a Rhino for 35 points, they still come in at being quite a cheap unit for what they do. Flamers, even in legions that aren't Salamanders, they come in, you know, quite effectively. And then you've got a Rhino to do stuff with as well, which is great. These make for great midfield objective units. Anything with a bunch of these Flamers, whether it's a heavy support unit with heavy Flamers or a tactical support squad, they can sit on an objective, they can deny it, they can attack your opponents. If your opponents come to try and push them off, they've got that scary Overwatch. And in some of the Rites of War for Salamanders, they can also be line as well when they've got these Flamers, which really works. That only really works in objective-heavy missions. If you're playing one of the sort of worst book missions where you're really just shooting each other, obviously these lose a lot of their value and a lot of their potential. But if you are playing objective-heavy missions, or if you're playing an opponent that's short-ranged or melee, of which there are a lot in Heresy, these are very, very good. Carrying on, they've also got the Dragonscale Storm Shield, so this gives you +1 to your invulnerable save for 15 points, which is just very good. It's a powerful thing to have access to. Anytime you can get down to a 3+ invulnerable save with a character is great. Inexplicably a bit worse than the Imperial Fist version on Tartaros Terminators, because a Salamander will only go to a 4, whereas the Imperial Fist version just sets it to a 3, which is a little bit wonky. But, you know, your Salamanders, you are probably going to use Cataphracti armor anyway, because, you know, we're all about the toughness and the raw, not the agility, so probably not that big a deal. Very powerful piece of war gear. Only goes on your independent characters, but obviously comes with Fire Drakes as standard, and is really, really good thing to have access to, having those super tough 3-up invuns in your army. And then we've got the Mantle of the Elder Drake as well. 35 points is expensive for Battle Hardened 1, I think. But again, when Praetors fight each other, or when big characters fight each other, very often, if one of them is immune to instant death, he's pretty much just going to win the fight hands down, because his opponent only needs to take 1 hit to die. And the difference in this and the Ultramarines version, for example, is this can go on a Terminator, whereas the Ultramarines version can't. So this is very good. So you can get your Terminator with a Dragonscale Storm Shield, a Mantle of the Elder Drake, a Thunderhammer, and that's a really, really tough Praetor. Maybe the toughest default non-named Praetor that you can get, and that's a really good thing for the Salamanders. So in summary, they've got a good Legion trait effect, but it misses enough things. You know, there's enough things that it just does nothing against, you know, other weapon types, melee armies, that kind of stuff, that it ultimately ends up being one of the weaker Legion traits for sure. They've got an advanced reaction with very high potential, very scary depending on what you're playing, but in most games, if you average out, most games, it probably has very low impact in most games as an average. They've got pretty poor Warlord traits, you know, as a whole. Not as bad as some Legions get, looking at you, Dark Angels, but, you know, certainly on the weaker end of the Warlord traits. They do have a very good one, but it's traitor locked, inexplicably. What they do have is an excellent armory. They can make really powerful characters, some of the toughest in the game. Even just having a 3+ invulnerable save can massively turn the tide in a duel, but having that on top of Battle Hardened 1 is very, very good. They can also make Flamers a viable primary strategy for your army. I would be really excited to see people using the Rite of War that makes Flamer units line, and then taking a lot of these very powerful, effective, cheap Flamers in objective-based missions where people have got to come and get you off those objectives. I think that's a potentially very good combo. It's just a shame, I think, a little bit that they didn't get a boost to melter weapons. So the best thing that happened in 40k was Salamanders got new rules that affected their Flamer and the melter weapons as well, which was cool. You know, you can do the whole fire theme, and they didn't get that in Heresy, which is a little bit disappointing to me as someone who plays Salamanders in 40k and was considering them in Heresy. So that's a bit of a shame, but what they do get is very, very good in that armory. And I think overall, out of this section of the book, Salamanders do okay. Certainly could have been better, but I think certainly also could have been worse. And when you look at it on balance of things, I certainly thought they were super weak initially when I read through this stuff. And now when I look at them, I think they've done pretty decently. And I think I'm quite excited to see them played more on the tabletop, and maybe even pick them up myself at some point. So that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed it all. If you've enjoyed it, please do leave me a like and a subscribe, and any comments or feedback you've got as well, drop them down below on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all soon. Bye bye.